Hi everyone, my name's Daryl. So I'm the proud original owner of this 2012 Nissan GT-R. Recently I had the opportunity to interview Jack McGee of Jack Transmissions to talk about the Nissan GR6 transmission. In this first segment, I asked Jack about the use of launch control. There's sort of a big debate out there among GT-R owners about the excessive use of launch control and what it can do to the durability of the GR6 transmission. Also, Jack talks about the maximum amount of horsepower that you can expect on a GT-R if you want reliability.
Well, we actually found that there's a little secret to the launch control to make it so you can launch it as many times as you want on a factory first gear and it will never break. And what we found is it took years to figure this out. But what we found is on the launch control above 4,000 RPM, 4,000 or above. Well, we actually found that there's a little secret to the launch control to make it so you can launch it as many times as you want on a factory first gear and it will never break. And what we found is it took years to figure this out. But what we found is on the launch control above 4,000 RPM, 4,000 or above, the clutch pressure gets clumsy on clutch engagement. It's really strange, and we haven't found a way to prevent it from happening. But what happens is you got basically a solenoid that that basically moves pressure to the clutch, to engage the clutch plates, because it works by hydraulic pressure. The more hydraulic pressure you have, the more the clutch, clamps down and engages, and the more torque you can transfer to the wheels. So when that solenoid kicks in above 4,000 RPM, it's like the fluid pressure gets clumsy. It doesn't have fine control of the pressure. So when you're above 4,000 RPM, 4,000 or above, and you're on the launch control and you let go of the brake and the clutch tries to engage, it's like the system panics. It engages too quickly. The solenoid hits the clutch too hard with pressure. It's like it can't modulate at that RPM. So you get this shock in the drivetrain. Like when you launch it, you get this, almost like somebody hit the bottom of the car with a hammer. And then after the shock, the car goes. And what we found is below 4,000 RPM, it doesn't do that. It's much more accurate in the application of the clutch. So what I found, like on a stock, like a factory turbo car, what you want to do is you want to tune on the car where if you're up on the launch control, you want the engine load to be high and you want the RPM to be low. Because the way you look at it is, so the wheels are at 0 RPM and your launch control is at 4,000 RPM. So when you let go of the brake and the clutch engages, the clutch's job is to try to slip, try to engage, but slip just enough to allow the wheel speed to increase, but engine RPM to decrease. So you get, the clutch is trying to match the speed of the wheels with the engine, right? When you launch. So when you take off, you want the car to begin to accelerate, to start to move, and then the engine RPMs to move down until they meet, and then you take off. And what happens is when that distance is too great, the system can't modulate the pressure well enough to engage smoothly. So on a factory turbo car, what we noticed is, even with aftermarket turbos, we've had, I think it was like 67 millimeter turbos that we got up at full song on the launch control below 4,000 RPM and get like a 1/260 foot on the track. Honestly, the software is out there. It's available now to put enough load on the engine where you don't have to run 6,000 RPM on your launch control to launch the car. Everybody thinks more RPM is better, and it's not. That is your enemy. The RPM is your enemy. What you want to do is you want the RPM to be as low as you possibly can while trying to get the engine under enough load to give you all the power you need to take off to get a nice whoosh off the line instead of that shock. So like on my DBA, I had the original trans in that car, where, if we're done testing transmissions in it for the weekend, I would put the original trans back in. It had the original first gear in it. And I would go to different events and stuff and launch it everywhere all the time. And the secret on mine was I would have my launch control only at 3,250 RPM. My launch control only go that high. It was very low, but we had the engine load way up. So it's still built boost there with the factory turbos. A built boost, no problem. And then when it would engage, I would take off, like even on like the worst road, since it didn't have that shock to break the tires loose, I just get this nice whoosh right off the line. It was consistent, and I could launch it hundreds of times that way. I would never break an axle, never break a gear. That shock is what you want to get away from. And I have no worries at all launching as much as I want. Doing that, it works extremely well. So with a lot of people out there, if you want a GT-R that's reliable, that works well for you, don't ever go past 900 horsepower. I mean, there's people out there in the performance world that say, oh, 1200 is reliable, blah, blah. It gets really expensive to go beyond 900. And, if you want to stay, economical and keep reliability up, we found that 900 horsepower, maybe 750 torque to the wheels, if you're really careful, will give you the best bang for the buck. But
it's kind of difficult, I think, to get to 900 horsepower just with full bolt-ons. I mean, you would have to do some other kinds of things to it. Probably.
Yes, and unfortunately, up here at 6,000 foot elevation, people go by corrected numbers. So 900 horsepower up here is like maybe 700 or 750. People always blow up the numbers.
So we all know that changing the transmission and differential fluids periodically is so important to maintaining the GR6 transmission. What I didn't know is there's lots of little filters that you need to change in order to properly do a service. So the other thing Jack talks about is how to tell whether or not your transmission fluid and transmission have excessive particles in them. So whether you change the transmission fluids yourself or have a dealer do it, there's lots to learn in this segment.
One thing I've noticed that people will change a fluid, but especially a dealership, and not the filters. It is incredibly important to change the filters and to use the right kind. So what they call the sump filters, the main filter that draws the fluid up into the oil pump, that's a steel mesh filter, for efficiency, so it can get, high volume of fluid and feed everything it needs. So that has to be a steel mesh. But what happens, a mistake a lot of people make is they'll pull that filter out and they'll look at the inlet of the filter and they won't see anything there. It looks clean, and then they'll reuse it. The problem is the way it's designed is the inlet is on one side of the filter and then the outlet is over on the other end. And you can't see the outlet. So the material, when it comes into the filter, it works its way over to the outlet side of the filter and collects there. You can have a trans that'll break a gear. There'll be metal everywhere in a trans. You'll pull that filter out and it'll look brand new. And so you gotta be really careful with that. I think anytime you change a fluid, I know it's another expense, but I think it's very important to change out that sump filter. And then another filter that's even more important to change is what's called a line filter. So when you pull the sump filter out, directly above it, you'll see this large cap. It's like a dome. If you take that out, inside there's a paper filter. And paper filters filter 10 times better than steel mesh filters. So a lot of debris that gets past that steel mesh filter is going to get into that line filter. And the line filter does an incredible job, especially if it's a paper filter. A lot of people still sell steel mesh versions of that, and I don't understand why they do that, because it allows too much material to get past, and it creates all kinds of issues, down the road. But if you get a good line pressure or line filter that's paper, that's probably one of the most important things you can do to the trans when you do an oil change, because what happens is all of the solenoids in the trans are essentially large magnets.
Okay.
So any, oh, did you want me to stop?
Hold on. My wife's got. Yeah. Yeah. We're almost done. Okay.
Essentially, the solenoids are like large electromagnets. So whenever they're operating, any metal in a trans is attracted to the solenoid and gets inside the solenoid. And it'll make the solenoid lazy, sticky, or whatever. So as much as you could do to keep metal particles away from the fluid, the better. Like, like changing that filter is probably one of the best things you can do, for solenoid longevity. I hate to say this because I don't want anybody to hate me, but when it comes to dealerships, I'd have them touch as little as possible. Have them do the fluid change, the two filters, with the pan gasket, put the pan back on, and I probably just have them leave everything else alone, because if they get into the utility and do things like a relearn and stuff, they could change some parameters in there that could affect the trans longevity and stuff too. That's a tough one on a relearn type thing. If you can get a hold of somebody's Ecutech laptop or something and plug it into your car and just do a quick relearn on the CCM on the trans, you're probably better off doing that. But if you're with a trusted dealership that listens to you, if you have them do a relearn for you, just tell them, do not change any other parameters. Just do the relearn and that's it. Like, don't change, anything else in there that can be changed. And that'll probably be the best way to go about it.
Okay.
GR6 talking to you again. If you have a lot of material in your oil, a lot of metal, your line pressure gauge at idle will slowly get lower and lower and lower, because the line pressure solenoid that regulates that pressure is extremely sensitive to material in the trans. It'll build up inside that solenoid, and it won't be able to pulse and engage like it used to, open the valve to regulate the pressure like it used to. And as material builds up, it gets weaker and weaker and weaker, and your pressure gets lower and lower and lower. So if you find that your line pressure at idle, when the car is fully warmed up, if it's getting really close to the red on the low side, it could mean you have material in the trans.
So when I got my GT-R 12 years ago, every time I jumped in it, I put it in race mode. Little did I know, by doing so, I was actually hurting the transmission and possibly shortening its life. In this segment, Jack talks about why.
You're in. If you want your transmission to last longer, I would recommend never using transmission R mode on the street, because the gear prediction is pretty aggressive on that, and you're wearing your transmission out without even knowing it. So with gear prediction mode, so in normal mode, when you're driving, if you're in third gear, it pre-selects fourth. It always pre-selects next gear higher. If you have the transmission in R mode, what happens is like you're in third gear. If you let off the throttle, it'll engage second. It'll pre-select second gear. So the synchronizer, shift fork, everything is moving to second gear. And then when you get on the throttle, you begin to accelerate. The system's like, oh, you're probably going to want to upshift from third. So it'll engage fourth and pre-select it. And if you're just driving down the road normally, it could be going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth all the time. So the synchros, fork, everything is working. So, shift solenoids, everything, always working back and forth all the time. So R mode is it's not going to wear it out completely in short time or anything, but it's more the transmission has to do.
Yeah.
So it's going to wear more quickly. So people that when they get in their car, and you see it all the time in videos, they immediately just push it up into R, and they're just driving around normally. They're wearing their trans out prematurely.
One of the most common problems on GT-Rs is a fried ETS or all-wheel drive unit. In this next segment, Jack talks about how that can happen.
The ETS can wear very quickly if you have a careless driver at the wheel. So one of the things you need to watch out for, and again, it'll talk to you if you're being too abusive with it, is if you're on a road where you either launch it or go full throttle in first gear and the rear tires start to spin, the ETS will clamp down as hard as it can and send as much torque as it can to the front wheels to combat that, to help pull the car along. But what a lot of people will do, and it's just due to them, they just don't know, is they'll stay on the throttle, with like VDC off, traction control off. They'll stay on the throttle and keep spinning the tires, and the ETS will stay fully clamped, and it'll keep trying with, with no success to send power to the front wheels. And it can't catch up. Eventually, if you spin too much and you have too much power going through, the amount of torque it sends to the front is not very much. And it eventually hits its limit, and it'll just stay clamped the whole time you're doing your burnout, basically, at that point, because the front drive isn't doing anything. And when the clutch plates are clamped at full load like that, they're turning, they're generating friction. So they're fully clamped down, generating a ton of friction in a very small environment that immediately the temp just goes through the roof immediately. So the fluid will burn, the plates will burn in very quick fashion. I've seen cars with less than 20,000 miles of the dead ETS. So
we all want hard shifting GTRs, right? Well, in this next segment, Jack talks about clutch crossover harshness and why sometimes it's really not best for the longevity of the transmission.
Back to the clutch operation. So when you go from third gear to fourth gear, what it does is it's already shifted there. It already has it pre-selected. When you hit that paddle and it shows that number 3 to number 4, it's not shifting to that gear. It's already got that gear selected. What's happening is the clutch that's engaged in third gear will let go, and then the clutch for the even gears will engage. And that's called a crossover. So when you cross over from one clutch to another, it should be almost seamless. You should feel a little bit, but it shouldn't be harsh.
Right.
If on a lot of tunes, a lot of tuners out there do not like to spend the time to make clutch crossover smooth and how should I put it, and non-aggressive. So if you're test driving a vehicle, or if you're driving a vehicle now, and when you shift from one gear to another, if you feel the car, if you feel that shock, it's always the shock that kills everything. If you feel the car jerk, you go to engage the gear, it goes boom, and you shift to the next gear, boom, it does that. These wet clutches in these cars, I don't care how many plates it is, how aggressive it is, it does not need to do that. So you got to be really careful if you're looking to buy one. That crossover, how harsh that feels, will give you a pretty good idea if things are under a lot of stress or not.
So that's it. In my next installment of this interview, Jack talks about the differences between the CBA and DBA transmissions. Whatever you previously thought, Jack's going to probably provide you some additional information for you to think about if you're considering purchasing a CBA in the future. As always, if you got some value from this video, please like it. Jack's put so much time and effort into this video that I'd really like us as a community to show our appreciation. Also consider subscribing, because I have additional videos coming up with Jack's content. And I hope to see you again in the next one very soon.
I've seen a lot of change, been through a lot of pain. Some things are not the same as they were a year ago, but all will be okay. I move on each and every day. The past is where it stays, way back a year ago.